Hello and welcome back to Iron Horse Garage. Today we're tackling a beast of a project, a classic 1965 Jeep CJ5. We'll be doing an engine and transmission swap. We're ditching the old drivetrain and giving this old goat some new life. This Jeep is already set up with a Chevy 350 engine. We will also be installing a GM SM465 4-speed transmission and 205 gear drive transfer case out of an 80s Chevy pickup. We're going to go through this thing and install new seals, change the oil, make sure she's good to go. To keep things running smoothly, we'll also be installing a brand new fuel tank and sending unit. So buckle up and let's get greasy. Now this used SM465 might look a little rough around the edges, but don't let that fool you. It's a whole lot cheaper than a brand new transmission, and with some TLC, this baby will be good as new. Thanks to our sponsor, Super Clean, we have some of the best degreaser there is. Let's get this baby soaking. So these drive lines are already pretty short, but may need to be modified once we get the new transmission and transfer case in place. The transmission from the engine, loosening up all the bolts that hold the bell housing to the back of the engine so we can drop the transmission. It's gonna get tight.
Watch your face.
Move transmissions like a professional.
Now that the transmission is out, we're gonna pull the engine. We're going to stuff a brand new Chevy Vortec engine into the engine bay. Here's our newly rebuilt 350 Vortec engine. But before we stuff it in our Jeep, we need to finish putting our new gaskets and seals in our transmission and transfer case and get these things mated together.
This tank is the only one that we can find that will work in the Jeep with everything we're putting on it. So go ahead and fill this up and see if we can find any leaks. We definitely have a leak. And it also looks like this seam here is leaking as well on the bottom. We'll go ahead and get that repaired. Okay, we got the leaks fixed on this tank here. Now we're getting ready to go ahead and put this bad boy up under there. I will now be installing this crank sensor here on the bottom side of this block. It won't be used on this application, but we have to have it in there to prevent anything from leaking out of the spot where this is supposed to be. Now that we have the transmission all sealed up, we're going to get the engine ready to install. But before we do that, we need to put our flywheel on and our clutch assembly on. So right now I'm going to put our pilot bushing in. Make sure we get that centered, get something flat to kind of drive that thing in with. Now we're going to go ahead and get our flywheel thrown on the engine here. Just make sure we get it lined up on the dowel, just like that. And we'll throw our bolts in. We are going to put a little bit of blue Loctite on these just to ensure they don't come loose over time. Now we're just going to go ahead and torque these flywheel bolts all down to spec. I'm going to install the clutch and the pressure plate assembly. So we'll go ahead and get that on there.
So we're getting ready to drop the engine into the Jeep. These are the old style Chevy motor mounts and they fit directly into the newer engine. So we're going to put those on and get her in.
Right now we're getting our bell housing bolted up. We ended up using the old style clutch fork because it's a lot more heavy duty than the newer style that came with this bell housing.
Now that the engine is in place, we're going to slap the transmission in.
Right there. So here you can see the comparison between the old transmission here, a little 3-speed, and the new beefier heavy-duty 4-speed that we're going to throw in there. We'll have to do some custom drive shafts on this, but it should be good to go. Well, if you look here, you can see this is not going to fit under there. We're going to have to jack up the side of this Jeep so we can roll the tranny under there. Put the shifter in front of this here.
You're going to have to go up higher on that front jack.
Technical difficulties. That ain't going to fit.
Okay, stop.
We got the transmission in. Now we're just tightening up the bolts. We ran into another issue on our NP205 transfer case. The output shaft on it is centered, and on the stock rear end, the differential is offset to the right side. So we got a match set of front and rear ends out of a 73 Wagoneer. The rear end is a Dana 44 and the front is a Dana 30, which is the same as the stock CJ5 front and rear ends. We have 373 gears in both the front and the rear, which is the same as stock as well, and it should pair up nicely with our transmission and engine that we have in this. Once we got our transmission and transfer case installed, we realized that our NP205 transfer case was too long for this short a wheelbase. So we got a custom Dana 300 transfer case from Novak Conversions, and that should give us enough room to work with under there. The first piece of our kit is our adapter plate to adapt our transfer case to the back of the SM465. And then we have our adapter shaft to adapt the splines from the back of our output shaft on the transmission to the input of the transfer case. And then there's our transfer case, which is complete with a new speed sensor, and it even comes with a shifter.
When you buy the adapter kit through Novak, it comes with your shaft that we had already showed you, the seal, and the mounting plate. We will not be using this shaft because our transfer case already has one installed. To start with, we're going to install 3 studs in the back of the transmission so that we can slide our adapter onto the back of the transmission and not have any clearance issues with trying to get bolts in there. One thing to be careful with is if you go past that mark right there, which we've already marked out, you'll be into the gears of the transmission, so you need to make sure to check that. And make sure you get a little grease on your seal and the transmission outpush shaft. Now we'll put our gasket on and slide the adapter in place. And the rest of these holes will get regular bolts. Now that our transmission adapter is in place, we're going to need to grind the outside of the transmission slightly to clear our shifter and linkage. Now that we got it all ground down, we'll just touch up our paint, call it a day. So we're ready to install the transfer case. And since this transfer case is only 100 pounds, I'm going to go ahead and throw it in by hand. And you can see here why we needed to grind that transmission web a little bit for clearance on our shifter pieces. In deciding what clutch to use in our Jeep project, we decided to go once again to Novak Conversions and use their hydraulic clutch system. The Novak kit comes with a new clutch fork, slave cylinder, the bracket that goes on the bell housing, push rod, all the hardware, and a new ball stud for the bell housing. Needless to say, the clutch we already installed in the Jeep will not work with the Novak kit, which means we had to go with a diaphragm style clutch and remove the transmission and bell housing and start this process over. We will install our new clutch fork into the bell housing before we put it back on. Now we have the bell housing installed with the slave cylinder bracket. Next we'll install the slave cylinder and push rod and connect the hose to the master cylinder. To make our Novak kit work properly, the original throwout bearing was actually too short, so we had to go with a longer throwout bearing, and now we'll get this thing put together. Now that we got it in place, we're also going to build a custom cross member to bolt everything into the frame. Our old one is no longer going to work. On top of that, it's damaged and twisted. So we'll get our new cross member marked out and drilled, and we'll need to cut some access holes in the frame and get everything mocked up. So we'll get a couple pieces of tubing cut and welded to our brackets coming off of the frame, and then we'll mock up a piece in the center to try to get this similar angle for our new cross member. The cross member is now fully welded and ready for the finishing touches. We'll clean it up to remove the rough edges and attach the mounting pad for the transfer case. We'll wrap things up with a fresh coat of paint to protect it from the elements. Now that our custom cross member is finished and painted, we're going to go ahead and bolt this in and move on to the transmission tunnel.
The old transmission tunnel has been scabbed together and will not work. We need to modify the floor to accommodate the shifters for the transmission and transfer case. This will require a custom floor tunnel. So naturally, we got onto Facebook Marketplace and purchased a tiny vintage radio flyer wheelbarrow. It's gonna make for a great transmission tunnel after some modifications. Let's go see how it fits.
We will be removing our axles from this rear end. We're going to put some new bearings and new seals on this and get it all freshed up for the customer. We're going to pry our axle out of the housing. Most of the time you would use a slide hammer that bolts on the threads here to pull it out, but you can also do it with a pry bar. And there it is. Now that we have our axle out, you can see that we have excessive play in our bearing and our seal has separated from the rubber. We'll be removing the bearing, the inner race, with a torch. Try and keep the heat pretty even to get it off that shaft. I'm going to have him spin this shaft while I'm heating up on this bearing here. And if all goes well, this will fall off of there once it gets hot enough and expands enough. We will try and keep as much heat as we can out of the shaft. She's ready now. We now have the rear axle cleaned. We got all the rust and the grease off. We sprayed it with a rust inhibitor primer and a semi-gloss black paint. We did the same thing with the front axle. So right now, I'm going to get these ball joints installed into the knuckles, and then we'll get them installed and the fitment checked on the front end.
We're going to remove the old Dana 30 and get the new Dana 30 ready for install. Our old axle is a closed knuckle design, which is pretty heavy duty, but they take kingpins and there's not a lot of disc brake options for the closed knuckle setup. That's why we went with a more modern open knuckle setup. We can adapt our brakes to it and it's easier to find parts for. The other main difference with the open knuckle design is that this requires two ball joints, one on top and one on bottom.
We need to replace our axle seals on our Dana 30 front end, but in order to do that, we first have to remove our differential carrier and then get our new seals installed. We'll go ahead and get all the dirt and grime cleaned out of our housing, get it prepped and ready for installation of our new axle seals. Now that our axle seals are installed, we'll go ahead and get our pinion shaft installed in the housing and get our pinion preload set. So in order to get our correct preload, we need to install these shims in front of this outer bearing. We'll get those installed on the shaft, get our bearing installed, and then we have some shims that go on the back side of this bearing and a big washer. And we'll get our yoke installed, our nut. We'll torque this down to 200 foot-pounds. So now we'll go ahead and check our pinion preload, which should be around 10 to 15 inch-pounds. Now that we have our pinion finished, we'll go ahead and get our differential carrier installed. We have our carrier torqued down. We're gonna check for backlash on our ring gear and check our contact pattern from the pinion to the ring gear. Before we get our knuckles installed on our housing, we have to knock out the old studs that are in it and install the new studs that are provided in our brake kit. So it's important to note that the direction we have these installed, we want this flat side in towards here so that we have enough clearance for our axle. With our new studs installed, we'll go ahead and get our knuckles installed on our housing. We'll go through our ball joint setup procedure. First, we have to torque our bottom ball joint nut to 70 foot-pounds, and then we torque our ball joint sleeve to 50 foot-pounds and the top nut to 100 foot-pounds. Now that our ball joints are set up, we'll go ahead and put our axles in. We're gonna go ahead and get our spindles installed on our front end, but before we do that, we need to get our bearings installed inside of these. With our spindles installed, we'll now get this front end thrown under our Jeep and we'll finish our installation with it in place. Front end is in place, we'll go ahead and get our wheel hubs assembled and installed. First, we need to get our bearing races installed inside of these wheel hubs. Next, we're going to get our caliper mounting brackets installed, but first we need to clean up our holes because when they were torched out, they're pretty rough. With our caliper mounting brackets on, we're going to pack our wheel bearings and get these hubs installed. Now we're going to install our new mile marker locking hubs, which shouldn't require any modification at all. With that installed, we'll now go ahead and get our rotor and our brake caliper installed and wrap these front brakes up.
Now that our differentials are in place, we need to measure for our driveline length. Thanks to Idaho Drivetrain, a local driveline shop down the road, we got these awesome custom drivelines to fit our unique build. These drivelines include 1350 U-joints and a double cardan U-joint on the rear for more extreme angles. The rear driveline needed to be shortened and the front driveline had to be lengthened. These were required to tie in our custom transmission and transfer case.
We just got our disc brake conversion kit in for this 65 CJ5. This kit is from the Jeepster Man, and they are a family-owned business, and they make all their parts in-house, minus our calipers. Now we're gonna go ahead and get our backing plates installed, caliper mounting brackets, but first things first, we gotta get our studs installed in the housing. We're going to get our caliper bracket spacers installed, and then we'll get the bracket bolted on and get the caliper mounted up.
So on our axles on the rear of this Jeep, we had to go with a longer stud. The problem with this stud is it has a shoulder on it, and it will not clear the hole that they have drilled in the rotor and sit flat against your axle flange. So the only answer for that is to drill these rotors out with a 5/8 drill bit so that everything sits nice and flat the way it's supposed to, and then we can get our spacers on. So your typical Jeep axle is a 625 knurl. For whatever reason, ours takes the bigger knurl, which is a 665, and we could not get the 665 knurl in a 2-inch long stud to adapt to our spacers, which is why we had to drill the rotors out.
We're gonna go ahead and get our wheel studs installed, but we have to remove this axle to make it easier to install them. We ran into a slight issue on our brake kit on this CJ5. Our caliper mounting bracket has to be trimmed to fit around one of the axle flange bolts. We got our brakes installed on one side here. We had to modify this caliper mounting bracket to fit the caliper, and we have had to modify every single part on this brake kit except for the calipers themselves. And we now have to also modify the brake pads themselves according to the instructions we were given from the people we purchased these from. We have to grind down these ears on this outer brake pad so it is not contacting the rotor.
Now our rear brake assembly is complete. We also welded a couple of tabs to hold the brake lines onto the rear axle and built some custom brake lines to tie everything together. To get a better idea of the work put into this project, we only filmed about 10% of the work done. And we're about 11 months into this build, so let's recap a few things that we've done.
We did a custom engine, transmission, and transfer case install.
We rebuilt front and rear axles, new seals and everything, and a 4-wheel disc brake conversion.
There was an extreme amount of modifications to get all these parts functioning properly together.
Let's get it fired up and go. Let's get it fired up and go for a test drive. That's it for this project. Stay tuned for the next one.